All right, good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to be introducing tonight's webinar from the Upper Midwest branch of the International Dyslexia Association. My name is Sue Hegland, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors for IDA-UMB. And our speaker tonight is Jane Heinemeier, who has been a faculty member at the University of South Dakota for 25 years, and who also serves as the clinical director of the USD Scottish Rite Children's Clinic in Sioux Falls. She has been a practicing speech-language pathologist for 35 years and brings a great deal of experience working with students with a wide variety of disabilities. And she's worked with these students in many different settings. She has particular experience and interest in language-based learning disabilities across the lifespan. And she's been educating about dyslexia, advocating for students with dyslexia, and identifying students in South Dakota with dyslexia for decades. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Jane tonight because I have a particular personal appreciation for the pioneering work that she has done. I think it was about this time of year, about 14 years ago, when our oldest child was in 5th grade, that I had my first phone conversation with Jane. And I can still remember her saying, you know, I don't think your son has auditory processing disorder, but I'd like to test him for dyslexia. And I can remember thinking, our son cannot be dyslexic. He can't write, he can't spell, but he can read. So it can't be dyslexia. But at the time we were desperate to figure out what was going on, and we trusted Jane and said, testing for dyslexia sounds great. And sure enough, our son is dyslexic. And I'm so grateful for that understanding that Jane has about how these various language issues fit together. It has made the difference for my son and has made the difference for so many children in South Dakota. So along with our audience tonight, Jane, I'm very appreciative that you're here to talk with us about language and literacy and how they interconnect. And I want to welcome you and thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Sue. Wow, after an introduction like that, I kind of feel like I'm going to be stumbling all over my words and can only be a disappointment to everybody. This is my first time being on this side of the computer in a webinar. While I've attended them, I've never been a presenter for them. So I ask all of you, my goodness, it looks like 102 of you. I ask for your patience with me and tolerance if I end up fumbling a bit. But I'm very happy to have you here. And I'm going to ask maybe if you guys could respond in to Sue a little bit about why you're here. It would help me to know the makeup of the group. If most of you are coming here as parents, or if you're coming here as educators or tutors. If you're coming here as a speech language pathologist, you're going to know this stuff. At least I assume you are, because this is really, I use the term boot camp because that's really what I want to talk to you guys about. It's just kind of a basic understanding so that hopefully you have a comfort level with how it relates to literacy. So, okay, so maybe what I'm going to do is get me off of this screen because I sure don't like looking at that, and we'll get started. Okay, so when I was looking for some fun logos, because I figured everybody's going to be doing this webinar in an evening in the winter when they're tired already and it's dark outside and somewhat gloomy, I was hoping to find something interesting. And I don't know if you find that or not, but this logo on the left side I thought was really quite appropriate. It does a nice job of showing the intersection of reading, writing, speaking, and listening, with, of course, the black circle being language and how it all ties together. So hopefully that makes sense to you. I have 4 main learner objectives. And the first and foremost is I hope that you go away from this evening with an improved understanding of the parameters of speech and language, and that you better understand that relationship between language and literacy. I hope that you will be able to recognize signs of language deficits and also go away with some information about how you can support those individuals who have underlying speech and language deficits. I should probably tell you first just a little bit about me and where I come from. So I don't know how many of you are from South Dakota or the Sioux Falls area, but my employer is the University of South Dakota, and I am the clinical director of this very long name, USD Scottish Rite Children's Clinic for Speech and Language Disorders. quite a mouthful. And it's that way because we have a lot of sponsors. Our mission is to serve kids birth to 21 and their families, and we really are a full-service speech and language clinic. So we do a lot of what you might think of as more traditional speech and language services, such as screenings, evaluations, regular therapy, and parent professional education. We also do have a big literacy component. At this time, what we are able to do primarily, though, is in the realm of evaluations. We're starting a new screening program, and in more outreach education. We really aren't set up to do in-house literacy treatment. We just need about 5 more staff members to be able to do that. Another big part of our mission is that we are a training institution for master's level speech language pathology students at USD. And so a big part of our services are provided by graduate students. Our long name, because we do have 3 partners, the University of South Dakota, as I mentioned, the Scottish Rite Foundation of South Dakota, and the Sioux Empire United Way. So we are what's known as a Right Care program, and you may be familiar with that. There are actually, I looked this up today, so I would be current, 182 Right Care clinics across the nation. They are all sponsored by Scottish Rite Masons. That is their national philanthropy. And their missions are all to serve children, and usually language only, sometimes speech and language, and sometimes literacy only. They're all a little different that way. And so I couldn't remember exactly who all is involved in the Upper Midwest branch. So I looked, and I figured Minnesota is a pretty safe bet, right? So there are 3 Right Care clinics in Minnesota, one in Minneapolis, St. Paul, one in Rochester, and one in Duluth. There are 2 in North Dakota, one in Fargo, one in Bismarck. There are 4 in Iowa, one at University of Northern Iowa, one in Des Moines, one in Davenport, and one in Sioux City. And in South Dakota, we also have 4, 2 that are affiliated with the University of South Dakota, our clinic in Sioux Falls, and the one in Vermilion on campus, one in Rapid City that is affiliated with Lifescapes, and one in Aberdeen, affiliated with St. Luke's. So the nice thing about Right Care is that they have a creed that no child be denied services for financial reasons. And so it's really nice to be on the side of an employment situation where you don't have to worry if people can pay or not, if they can receive services with you. So that's who we are. And I know you probably have all seen this definition.
Can I jump in before you continue on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Probably 30 people type in comments about who they are and why they're here. And I would say it's the gamut. We have teachers from 1st grade. We have a 7th grade teacher. We have special education teachers. We have people who are CALP certified, people who are Title I teachers, OG tutors. We have someone who's the parent of an autistic student, wants to understand more about autism and dyslexia. Someone who wants to understand a little bit more about the relationship between speech and young children and dyslexia. So all kinds of people, okay. Parents, teachers, tutors, special education teachers, Title I teachers, all kinds of people.
Wow. Well, thank you, Sue. And thank you, everyone, for giving me at least a little bit of an idea of who you are, since I can't look out in the audience and see you. I have to tell you, this is kind of weird that way. I'm sitting down in the basement of my home, looking at a computer screen and imagining 112 people across the airwaves. So thanks for your input. So just to kind of come back to this dyslexia definition, I don't think I'll read the whole thing. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. You can see it on your screen. But what I want to point out to you is the 3rd sentence, which says, these difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. So inherent in the definition of dyslexia is the reference to a deficit in language, particularly in the phonological component. So as we continue this evening, we'll get more into what that actually means. So if dyslexia is defined as a language-based disability or reading disability, I'm hoping then tonight you can get a sense of how that does relate to other difficulties in language development as well. So let's get started with our boot camp, and let's just talk about speech. So hopefully this is a pretty good area of comfort for most of you. I think for those of you who are educators and maybe work in the public schools, you often think of the speech teacher as the one who's in the art room or in the closet down the hall and who comes a couple days a week and pulls the kids so that they can work on their S's and their R's and their L's. Hopefully, you'll come back with a greater appreciation of what other resources your speech language pathologist can offer you. But when we think of speech, I do think that's probably what most people are comfortable with. Articulation, meaning your production of your speech sounds. So a typical articulation disorder would be those children who have trouble saying. Maybe they do a W for L, W for R. Maybe they distort their S's. So particular speech sounds are not produced correctly. A more severe type of a speech disorder would be what's called a phonological processes disorder. Now, this is where it gets a little confusing, and because we just talked about phonological awareness, I want you to think not that. This is phonological processes or patterns. So the kids who are really hard to understand, they have a lot of speech sound errors. And when you look closely at them, those errors tend to fall in patterns where the particular processes were not learned correctly. So say you have a child who leaves off the endings of all the words. It doesn't matter what sound it is. They can maybe make that sound in isolation or in a different part of the word, but they just never put it at the end. They haven't learned that phonological process. We call it final consonant deletion. Say you have a child who makes K's and G's. Instead of making those sounds, they make a T or a D. So that's called fronting, because what they're doing is they're taking the sounds that you make at the back of your mouth. You can even just kind of say it to yourself, make a k, k, and then make a t, t. You can see that you shift from back to front. So that's called fronting. That's another phonological process. So phonological processes are a more severe speech sound disorder. Then you've probably heard of apraxia of speech. Sometimes it's known as childhood apraxia of speech or CAS. Sometimes they call it dyspraxia. You know how sometimes you do say tomato or tomato. Apraxia of speech can also be a pretty significant speech disorder. But in this case, what you're looking at is more motor programming. So I think a good analogy is if you can think of your brain is a little, like a nice little circuit, little computer circuit going, and you've got this nice signal going from your brain to your lips and your tongue and your cheeks so that you can execute speaking. In apraxia, it's like that signal gets jumbled. It's the motor program that gets jumbled. The child knows what they want to say. They don't have dysarthria or muscle weakness. There's nothing wrong with the strength of their muscles. They just get the signal jumbled. And so what happens is many times kids' speech is very limited with childhood apraxia speech, especially when they're very young. And then as they mature and start getting more skills, their speech may start to sound more like phonological processes because they're getting just that many more sounds that they can actually execute, but they still can't necessarily program to get them correct. So those are the three primary speech sound disorders that you may run across. Other speech disorders, though, would include fluency, aka stuttering, or voice disorders, which can involve resonance. Those would be maybe some of the kiddos that have hypernasal voice quality, kids who've had a cleft palate, or kids who are faux nasal. Maybe they have big tonsils and adenoids, and they always sound kind of stuffed up, and their resonance is goofy because of it. You can have voice disorders where the pitch is too high or too low, or they talk too loud and yell all the time, and they're hoarse all the time, and their quality is goofed up. So, you know, you realize that this class, speech disorders could be a full semester course. So this is very much an overview. But those were the ones I wanted to point out to you. And
Jane,
some of this, yes.
I have a question, and I thought maybe it would be helpful to just jump in with that, because it's a clarification on one of the things that you said, or just a question about that. Someone asked, and I'm going to just tell you what they typed: is substituting F for TH a phonological processing error in a third grader?
No, F for TH in a third grader would just be an articulation error. And actually, it's not that uncommon developmentally. TH is one of the last sounds to be mastered, and the typical sound substitution is F.
But I just was, reading what they said there. But I think it's,
sure.
There you go. Thank you.
But I will. This might help the person who asked that question. A phonological processing disorder with TH could be stopping the sound. TH and F and SH, they're all made, we call them continuants. The air continues. The air, as long as you can make the air go, the sound will continue. A stop is something like a t or a d or a b. You stop the air to make the sound. So a phonological process of stopping would be, instead of TH, they'd probably do a T. Like fun could be ton or bun or pun, and sun would be ton, and that kind of thing. So
that's great.
Okay. Well, so the signs of speech difficulties. Again, I'd like to talk more about language tonight, so I'll try to not spend too much time on this. You could give lots of examples, but I thought just some basic guidelines. So when a child is 4, their family should understand them, their caregivers should understand them, and most of the people that don't really know them should probably understand them. So if they're 4 and those who they don't really associate regularly with, if they have trouble, that's a big red flag. By 5, a child should be understood by everybody in all situations, those that are familiar with them and those that are unfamiliar with them. But if you have speech difficulties, the mistakes or the errors can be very consistent, or they can be variable. And they might be, and sometimes if they're inconsistent, we like to think that that's a good prognostic sign, because maybe that skill is emerging. And it can be the gamut from, just a couple minor speech sound errors all the way to speech that's very hard to understand. I think if it's all right with you guys, I had a video that I could show. It's a cute little girl with some articulation errors, I think mostly are. But of all of my videos, the volume is not very good on this one, and I think most of you will get frustrated and you won't be able to hear it. So I'm just going to pass that. But the comment I did want to make is, so what's the relationship to spelling and later reading difficulties if you have a speech difficulty? And it's not hard and fast. I mean, every child that has a speech disorder is not going to have a reading disability. But there is a connection, and for those kids, if their speech difficulty is related to discrimination, or hearing and discriminating the different sounds correctly, many times those discrimination problems can result in later reading and spelling problems. It's because the kids can't really associate the letters with the sounds they represent. They tend to associate the letters with how they think the sounds are pronounced or how they pronounce them. So there is a connection, but it's not, like I said, it's not hard and fast. Okay, let's go on to oral language. So a nice definition is that oral language refers to the knowledge and skills we use to produce and to understand spoken language. So I think another big takeaway, and I think everybody probably knows this, but today I'm going to say it quite a bit, is language knowledge and skills are the foundation for learning to read and write. You have to have those foundation skills receptively and expressively before you can be an effective reader and writer. And then this other little bullet is kind of a nice takeaway. I think most people think about language development as being early childhood. And it is true that that is when the bulk of our language develops. But it's important to remember that we continue to learn language through adolescence and into adulthood. So even those middle school kids and those high school kids are continuing to develop their language, and hopefully in socially and pragmatically appropriate ways as well as functional ways. So these are the 5 parameters of language that you hear a lot. And we're going to talk about each of these after this slide. Phonology, semantics, morphology, syntax, and pragmatics. So we look at language by those major categories. We also want to look at those categories, but in the function of them, in that we look at your understanding or receptive language of those categories, and we look at your output or your ability to express yourself in those major parameters. And then lastly, we also look at your social or functional use of the expressive and receptive language skills. So those are the things that I want to briefly talk with you about. And probably many of you have seen this skilled reading rope diagram. I use it quite a bit in our presentation, and I'm hoping by the end you'll be pretty comfortable with it, because I think it really does a nice job of kind of illustrating the parameters of language and how they tie into skilled reading. So the first thing we're talking about is phonology. We've talked about phonological processing speech sound disorder when there's patterns of errors. Well, now we're going to talk more about phonological awareness and phonology, which again, the phoneme is that smallest individual sound, those individual sounds in spoken words. So phonology is the study of the speech sound system, including your rules for combining and using phonemes. In dyslexia, we care a lot about phonology and phonological awareness. So what is that? And I want to apologize to you guys. I didn't realize until I'd already kind of sent the PowerPoint on that this particular slide did not come through very clearly. But this is a nice little hierarchy of phonological awareness skills, with the less complex early developing skills being things like rhyming. Then as you go up the stairs, what happens is you go from long chunks to small chunks. So you have sentence segmentation. So if I said to you, "Hi, everyone," then we would segment out how many words are there? Well, there's just 2. Hi, everyone. That we're segmenting it into words. Well, then the next step would be syllable segmenting and blending. So if I said, "Hi, everyone," now we have hi, everyone. We have taps for each syllable. And then it continues to go on from the syllables to the sounds and different places in words for those sounds and phonemes to be. So that's kind of a nice little developmental skill. This next slide, I'm so glad you guys have, I'm assuming you're all looking at laptops or, your monitors so that you can see this nice and clearly. If we were at a conference and you'd be looking across a big room, obviously there's too much information on here and it would be overwhelming. But I think it has good information. And for all of you educators there, especially those of you that are early childhood folks, or for some of you guys who are literacy tutors and you're looking at phonological awareness, I love this slide because it's developmental and it's not always that easy to find out what ages kids should have these set skills at. So you see it has the age, it starts at 4 and it goes through 9, and it has the skill domain, and then it gives you examples. So if you're not quite sure what they mean by sound deletion, syllable deletion, or even blending onset or rhyme, you can find that. This is from Reading Rockets, and many of you are probably very familiar with this website. It's a very good one. If you haven't gone to it before, I would encourage you to do so. So like stupid puns. I guess maybe that comes with being a speech pathologist and liking words. And I thought about now you're probably getting bored and you're sick of sitting here and it's kind of getting late at night. So we'll see if you can enjoy some puns that have to do with phonological awareness. Elision is taking away a sound. That's a very important phonological awareness. So these are a few jokes for it. So the joke is, what did one ball say to the other hand? Nothing. He just looked round. Of course, so the sound that's left off for the elision task is he looked around. And of course, I can't hear you guys groaning, and I don't know if you think that's totally stupid, but we'll go through the rest. So I kind of like this elision joke. So who do vampires fall in love with? And the answer is the girl next door. You like that one? Good, Sue. Yeah, because we left off, of course, in elision. What if I said, say next? And then I said to you, okay, now say next, but don't say t. You would get next. That, by the way, is a higher level elision task. And then the last one, can you stand another elision joke? So the joke is, knock, knock. Sue, who's there? Iris. Iris who? I risk my case. I rest my case. I just can't explain anymore. So that's elision, and hopefully you guys will remember what elision is. A couple other rhyming jokes, which rhyming is an early developing phonological awareness skill, one of the first ones. So what's the difference between a hippo and a zippo? One is really heavy and the other is a little lighter.
People are typing in that they like these, Jane, just so you know.
Oh, good. Good. Thank you. And the wordplay is always fun. And I love this one. So what do you call a Frenchman wearing sandals? Philippe Philop. That's awesome. And the last one, this really is the last joke of these. So what do you call a dog that does magic tricks? A labracadabrador. And by the way, if you are a child with dyslexia, you would have a heck of a time with any of those. So let's move on. We're going to go on to a little bit heavier topic of morphology. I think this is one of Sue's loves. And I'm not going to talk a lot about morphology, except just to understand this is one of those parameters of language that we have to learn about. Either we have to understand it and we have to be able to express it. And it has to do with your understanding and use of word parts. So a morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit in a language. And if you have functional morphological knowledge, obviously it will enhance your understanding for vocabulary, for reading, for spelling. If you understand your prefixes, your suffixes, your roots, you're going to be that much more proficient at language. And so we've got, of course, our rope diagram, and I want you to go back there again. You saw that we talked about phonological awareness already, which was our bottom strand. Phonological weaves in with decoding and sight word recognition to help become one of the ropes for our skilled reading skills. With phonological awareness, that is hopefully becoming more increasingly automatic as a student ages and matures and kind of just gets more skills. Well, whoopsies, somehow I need to not have that there. Now with morphology, we're looking at the upper strand, and these are the more basic foundational language skills that as you advance and become more proficient, those become more strategic. And morphology is a good example. If you understand that pre means before, and you have some new vocabulary, some new spelling that's using that pre suffix, it's going to help you quite a bit. I want to talk about vocabulary. It's no surprise that, of course, vocabulary is a very prime contributor to effective reading and writing. Not only can you not understand the text if you don't know the words, but you can't create a written composition or whatever the written task is without an effective, nice, sufficient store of vocabulary knowledge. And of course, there are very strong correlations between vocabulary and comprehension. So those are some of the overviews. And so when we talk about an oral language impairment, The primary term you're probably going to hear is something called specific language impairment, or SLI. Okay, so that is when a child has a definite impairment in their understanding and or use of spoken language. It can include acquiring vocabulary, learning grammar, syntax, etc. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go, but I want to tell you that when we say that dyslexia is a language-based disorder, remember that's more phonology-based. When a student has all of these core oral language impairments, they don't have dyslexia. They have a specific language impairment. It's a more global trouble with language. And I hope that makes sense to you, because that often is confusing. So here are some signs that you can look for. I chose to give you signs for school age because I figured most of you that were sitting in tonight would probably be for either your students or your own children that were now of school age and learning to read versus a preschooler or an adult. So difficulty understanding teachers' instructions, difficulty following instructions to the class, difficulty just following even the threads of class discussions, difficulty following any of the rules, the directions, following the conversation, not even keeping up with movies and movie plot lines. Difficulty in reading comprehension across subjects, especially those that tend to have a little bit more abstract material, science perhaps, or complex grammatical structure, a lot of technical vocabulary. And of course in math you see it more with a lot of problem solving, story problems, when reasoning and higher level language skills are involved. A lot of times when we get referrals for dyslexia evaluations, so often the reading comprehension, is a big concern. And one of our jobs is to tease out from the get-go, is reading comprehension a problem for the student because they can't read, and they're not understanding what they read? Or is it because they have an underlying problem with language and they can't really grasp when the syntax is that complex, or when there are more vocabulary advanced than they're used to reading? So those are a few examples. Now I am going to try to show you this video, and I hopefully won't screw up on it. What I'm actually going to do is switch. So this is a YouTube video, and it's from England, so that's kind of got some kind of fun accents if you're into listening to accents. And it's really more of an overview of specific language impairment.
Every child with a language impairment has slightly different difficulties and strengths within language, but there are signs to look out for, and it's important that teachers are tuned into these. A teacher may spot some difficulties or behaviours that could indicate a language difficulty. So, for example, a child may have difficulties at break, negotiating with their peers, or maybe understanding the rules of a game. In a classroom, the teacher may feel that the child is forgetful or perhaps a poor listener because they don't seem to be listening to the instructions or carrying out the instructions that they've been given.
Those children who have trouble getting down to their work might be an indication that the language is a problem for them. There are those children who avoid work, sit there staring into space, not finishing the task, perhaps because the language is too difficult for them. And then there are those children who are always looking around the room, copying what the others are doing to make sure that they are on track, and also copy beautifully, but don't produce the written work on their own that you might expect them to do.
If the teacher notices a child is blank with some questions, sometimes that means a child doesn't understand or doesn't get it, I guess. And also, if a teacher sees that a child can be quite distracting to other students, it's also, maybe it might be just behaviour, but sometimes it means that the child doesn't get it, so he gets distracted and wants to do other things, and might just lose interest in the subject.
There were some occasions when I got really angry that I just walk out of class or something like that. It just came to a point when I just didn't want to do homework because I just felt stupid.
Oh dear. Okay, I clicked out because I see we're getting a little bit long on time, and I'm wondering, Sue, do I have to quit right at 8 if we don't? Is that how that's going to fly? So I need to start cutting some things out.
No, you do not have to stop right at 8. We are recording this, so if someone has to leave at 8, which sometimes people do, they will be able to come and watch the rest of it. So that's nice. We have that flexibility.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Let me just mention too, I think the video and audio were a little bit out of sync and a little bit hard to hear. I'm just kind of.
They were. Okay. That's good to know. Thank you. Well, so a lot of what they were saying was a nice recap of some of the symptoms that you can watch for. But I do kind of enjoy listening to the older students talk about their language struggles, because I think we tend to assume by the time kids get in high school or get in junior high that if they have trouble, it's more because of other reasons other than just underlying difficulty comprehending language. So your next slide, I do have some expressive language signs. So these would be some of the symptoms that you might see more as an output in. And of course, I think all make sense as you look down the list. One of the things I wanted to point out is that we're also talking about written expression as an expressive language. So you may see that their quality of their written work is lacking. You know, the structure is maybe too simple or not quite addressing what the topic was supposed to be. You may also see a little bit more of that intent in communication or social use of language struggling. I'm thinking I may not show this video clip then, Sue, since you said there was a little out of sync for the expressive language disorder, but I'm going to try this one. I wanted to talk to you about word finding because this is one of the language, because it's more of a phonology type based struggle that you'll see in kids with dyslexia. It seems very often you'll find word finding difficulties. And in this case, they have the vocabulary knowledge. They know what the words mean. They just can't seem to retrieve it in the timely manner. Whoops, let's go back here. I don't know what I did there. Okay, this is a cute video, and it is also, I think these English people, they do a nice job of putting that information out there. I'm hoping that you can hear some of this.
Close. Oh, what is that? I just can't think of it. I know what it is. You know what it's like? You just can't think of a word. You know it, but you just can't say it. So it's in your brain, and it's frustrating, and you can't get it out. Sometimes it feels like you know what you're gonna say, and the other person's like, and then it just gets, you know what it is, it's there, but it's not actually there anymore. And you know it's like on the top of your brain, but you just can't get the word out. Clothes hangers. Hangers! Yeah, hangers. Clothes hangers. This is called word finding difficulties. Maybe it happens to you. It can be quite frustrating. Don't worry, it happens to lots of people. Sometimes it's like you got it and then it comes back to you maybe, I don't know, like the next day or maybe 10 minutes. Sometimes it's really frustrating when they don't get it. So what can you do when this happens? Let's find out.
So I'm going
First, you can take your time.
I'm going to move us on just because, again, I want to make sure that you guys are having time for questions. And if the sync is funky, then that's frustrating for you too.
And Jane, I think, I don't remember if we said this, but just so people know that when they get to that PDF, they can click those links and watch those with a little better audio too. So they'll be able to.
You're right. I neglected to say that. So you will be able to click on those links and get a chance to listen to it where hopefully you have a better connection. So another little language area I wanted to just briefly touch on was vocabulary. And if you have students who have an underlying language deficit, learning vocabulary is more of a challenge than kiddos who are more typically developing. They need more exposures, and they have a little bit more of a struggle retaining those newly words over time. So that's good to remember. And of course, vocabulary impacts your reading comprehension. And our poorest readers have the weakest vocabulary. You know, they lack that vocabulary needed to understand grade level texts, even if they can identify the word. So we've talked about social language, we've talked about receptive language, expressive language. This is a clip for pragmatic, and I may move on and just let you guys do this on your own. This happens to be, Sheldon. And, you know, any of you guys like to watch Sheldon, it's hilarious, and almost everything that he has is a social pragmatic communication issue. So that would be something I'll let you watch on your own. And part of the social pragmatic language are what we call the supralinguistic language skills, or like additional language. This is like more complex language that you pick up from things other than the obvious syntax, the obvious vocabulary or semantic knowledge. So it's things like the intonation that you use. If you're making certain body movements or gestures, it's the sarcasm. It's figuring out, ooh, that was a joke. I don't think I got it. Oh, you know, you're using those words that don't really mean what they say. And so supralinguistic language skills are very often another area of deficit. So then Sue mentioned the auditory processing problems. And what I want to tell you today is that I'm not an expert in this, and this is not going to be everything you need to know about auditory processing. What I hope to just help you tonight is to sort through kind of what it is compared to some of the other things we've talked about. These are two different definitions I have seen. I particularly like the simple one on the bottom. When you talk about auditory processing problems, think about it's how well your ear is talking to the brain and how well the brain understands what the ear tells it. So in other words, you can hear, your hearing acuity is fine, not a hearing loss, but it's more, once that signal gets there, is it perceived accurately? Other terms that sometimes you hear associated it, auditory processing disorder, central auditory processing disorder, auditory perceptual processing dysfunction, those are all terms, they all kind of mean the same thing. If you are wanting a central auditory processing disorder evaluation, that is it needs to have an audiologist and a speech language pathologist, and you have to have a sound booth, because the audiologist is going to do some complex testing, of course, ruling out any hearing loss, but looking more at auditory perceptual skills. Things like, can you discriminate sound in a noisy background? Can you determine which direction that sound is coming from? That type of stuff. The speech language pathologist can look at the language skills, can look at maybe some speech perception skills, speech production skills, some phonological awareness. Once it's identified if a person has a central auditory processing disorder, there are several things that are done. There's a couple of treatment approaches primarily. One is where they're training some of those auditory and listening skills, working on auditory discrimination. Can you tell that I just said fin, not pin? Localization of sound, sequencing sounds. It's noisy. Can you tell I've got some white noise going on. Can you tell that I just said fan? The important thing, though, is if you're training those auditory and listening skills, you need to also apply it to functional complex language so that you can have that carryover. You also will have the approach of, in addition to working on those certain auditory skills, let's use strategies to help facilitate processing of language. So things like using visual aids. Maybe we are making sure that everything's written on the board. Maybe the student has handouts printed out ahead, those sorts of things that you guys are probably all familiar with. You also look at seating. So you want the student to be away from those auditory and visual distractions to help focus. For example, it's good to be close to the teacher or the visual, maybe it's our smart board, but also away from the noisy hallway and the door or the window that could be distracting. So that would be the seating. Setting can also be adjusted because now what can we do to make it a better auditory environment? For example, you might have carpet on the floor. You might use study carols. The student might wear earplugs. You might start putting cloth poster boards on the walls. You might use an FM system where the speaker is wearing, the FM system, and the students are getting that speech channeled directly to them. You notice that it also talks about visual distractions, and of course, because you're wanting the student to be as focused as they can on the auditory signal. And so some of the cluttered bulletin boards and distractions that way may also be helpful to reduce. So you have seating, you have setting, you have accommodations, you have teaching the auditory specific skill, and then some things accommodation-wise for speaking is if you look at this list, those are very much what you would use also for kids who have just a language disorder. So this, I'm going to simplify this, and this is overgeneralized, and I'm sure you can find exceptions to this rule. But if you think about a student who has trouble with language, they could have trouble understanding and using language, so a receptive expressive language disorder, because they have that's their wiring. They have a specific language impairment. Or you could have a student with an auditory processing evaluation or disorder who also has trouble with language, but the core reason that they have trouble understanding language is because of how their brain is processing and perceiving that auditory signal. So I hope that makes kind of a little bit of a difference for you in understanding those. So this slide that I've moved on to, I think is probably one of the most important ones in the whole presentation I have, because these are the primary oral language impairments associated with dyslexia. Remember looking at that little strand, the rope that has all the components that you need intact for successful reading, and the strand that had phonology. That's the piece that we see in dyslexia. So kids with dyslexia most often have the following problems with the phonological component of dyslexia. Phonological awareness, that explicit awareness of the sounds of language. Phonological memory, can I remember the sounds in the words? Phonological retrieval, can I pull those sounds back out and help, for example, help me think of those words? We talked about word finding. And phonological production, can I hear those sounds? Can I produce them? Remember them? And you see it in some of these funky words that are just a little bit harder to say, like aluminum, specific, spaghetti. Kids with dyslexia will have that, I call it phonological softness, where the syllables might be just kind of inverted. I think sounds are just a little bit out of order. Those are the primary oral language impairments associated with dyslexia. Note, I didn't say receptive language, expressive language. That if it's more global, then you're talking about specific language impairment, and they're going to have trouble with language no matter what format. If it's dyslexia, it's going to be more that phonological component. So if you look at it, this is a list of some of the early childhood or emergent literacy indicators of dyslexia. So these are the kiddos, like say they're, first grade, 5, 6, 7, 8 even, and you're starting to look back. Okay, what are some of the symptoms that we've seen? Delay in speaking, difficulty in pronunciation, insensitivity to rhyme, word retrieval, indistinct vague language, trouble learning the names and sounds for letters of the alphabet. Those are all the phonological component of language. And then additionally, family history and kids that struggle even though they've had a lot of extra instruction. So I'm hoping that's starting to come together for you. Here's our wonderful Scarborough rope schematic again. And now when you look at that, we've talked about all of the core pieces of language, the more concrete phonology, morphology, etc. And you can see how they weave together to finally get that fluent, skilled reading. This is a very simple schematic. It kind of says the same thing, but much less to it. So another vision or a version of viewing dyslexia in the language system, you look on the left column. So if you take discourse, syntax, and semantics, how you talk, the way that you put your grammar together, and the morphology and the word knowledge, so you put those together, you get comprehension. That would be that upper strand. If you take the phonology, that helps you to get your decoding. And that phonologic weakness is what interferes with those higher level abilities necessary. Interferes with decoding, but you have the higher levels intact for comprehension. So 2 different ways of looking at it. And so I know we're getting very, very close here to being running out of time. This is what happens when you haven't had a chance to run through a presentation when you have no feedback from anybody in the audience. You don't know if you should be skipping stuff or not. But so what do you do if you think that there is a language deficit? The big takeaway is, refer for the speech language pathologist for an evaluation. We know about early identification. We know about remediation. But don't forget, we still need to identify and remediate language in adolescence. There are so many kids we see in our clinic that have never had their underlying language difficulties be identified. We'll have kids come, they're 14, 15, 16, and no one picked up on that yet. So just because they're older, it doesn't mean we still can't tease that out and find that they do have that difficulty and help to provide supports and remediation for them. Some of the things that could be done, and I'm going to kind of skim through some of these quicker, but you could do language and literacy groups for remediation. It could be run with a speech language pathologist and a learning specialist, a reading specialist, a special education teacher, or a gamut of specialists. But it works well if you can team together because you each bring your own set of skills that complement each other very well. You also can have direct speech and language therapy for those kids who have a specific language impairment. You can be doing classroom enrichments through the response to intervention model. Parents can be doing enrichment at home. You may be looking at literacy sessions, language sessions that are either individual, that are group. You may be looking at tutoring outside of school. Contracting for speech language therapy outside of school if that's important, if that's indicated, and certainly and hopefully first and foremost IEP services through the school. And those are of course lots of options. And how could speech language intervention in a school setting look like? There are just a few ideas here, and this is kind of actually geared more towards an SLP who was wondering, what could I do with intervention for literacy? Because not all speech language pathologists feel that comfortable and knowledgeable in helping to advocate for literacy. I think they're getting better at it. But some of the examples would be you could have just collaboration with students and the teachers. You can do the small groups. Integrating your written language as well as your spoken language. Your speech person hopefully can be a good asset to you in any of your IEP or multidisciplinary testing discussions, and certainly in RTI. And then some for parents. I kind of got the impression in this group we might not have a lot of parents of younger kids right now. These things that I've listed are really more that emergent literacy things that parents would do, 4, 5, 6-year-olds. But I do have a slide of a excellent resource here that Diana Hanbury King has, and it's wonderful for giving not only parents, but I think teachers and educators ideas of how you can work on those foundational skills in literacy and emergent literacy. And then what other things can we do to support those kids other than, let's refer them to an SLP and let's try to, do some enrichment at home. These are just some general strategies that are helpful. If you have someone that you're concerned with comprehension, of course, making sure that the student they're looking at you. You have their attention before you give the directions. Speaking slowly and clearly and using simpler directions that do follow a logical sequence. Words that are kind of good flag words, we call them. First, we do this. Next, get out your science book, and finally find your notebook or whatever your directions are. Anytime that you can add vision, anything visual really helps, and any demonstrations, and not the least important would be just checking for comprehension. We assume they got it. Well, let's have them restate back. Okay, can you tell me, what is the assignment? What was that story about? Now, if someone has expressive language difficulties, what happens is we tend to almost get interviews, like we just kind of fire questions to help get some kind of a response. So tell me about the book. What did you do? What'd you have for breakfast? What'd you play? And it ends up being not really a good conversation. So providing comments on what's happening is really helpful, because not only does it take the student with the expressive language problems off the hot seat, it also gives them a model. Oh yeah, I could say that. Oh, that's how you say that. That's what the word is. So comments are great. Giving extra time is really important. Giving them a model. So, an easy one is, a lot of times you have the kiddos who have trouble with pronouns. And, him went downstairs. And instead of saying, no, you say he. Say he. Instead, you can just model back, yes, he went downstairs. So you're modeling it, or you can expand. Give them, always taking that language one step further. You said this, I'm going to respond back with a little bit more, so you hear a little bit more how it could go. And then when you have those kids that just can't do it, they can't think of the word, they can't express it, rather than just asking an open-ended question, WH, open-ended questions are the hardest, or telling them the answer, why don't you give them choices? What about, you could either do this or it could be this, and then they can choose. And of course, context helps, especially if you're teaching vocabulary. And then I added a few more strategies that you can use to help older students. And some of these are the same, a little bit maybe more geared to a more complex language. And a couple of things I wanted to point out here would be to try to avoid some of those supralinguistic skills I talked about earlier. That meaning, you get the extra knowledge out of the subtle nuances of language. So don't, if you can help it, don't use sarcasm. Don't give comments or directions that are kind of ambiguous or are using that figurative language that they just don't get. It's easier to restate it in a very concrete, simple way. And, if you can think of some mnemonics to help them for strategies, using charts, using visuals, those, of course, help a lot. So as I'm getting close to wrapping up, these were some of the fundamental principles I was hoping that you would go away with. Again, remembering that spoken language provides the foundation for the development of reading and writing. And those kids who have trouble with spoken language usually have trouble learning to read and write. That is very reciprocal. But if you provide instruction in one modality, it usually helps the other modality. So we like to say, as oral language goes, so does written. They follow hand in hand. So that is really pretty much what I have to say. I liked this quote: "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." I don't know who Ludwig Wittgenstein was, but I like what he said. So that is what I have to say today. I hope you guys are still awake and with me. And I guess if Sue has some questions that have come through, maybe I could try to answer them.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I have to say there have been a number of people saying this is great. At the point that you were saying, I'm not sure if I should skip anything, someone said, please don't skip anything. This is all wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you.
People are appreciating that, and lots of comments that they're that it was an excellent talk. So I do have a number of questions, and a couple of people said they had to leave, but they know that the recording will be there. So if people need to leave, that's fine. But I'll go ahead and ask some questions, and I'll get started with that. And we could certainly share camera if we want to, but we certainly don't need to.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. Let's see if I can do that.
Look in here. Okay, there I am. There
Okay.
you are. Okay, so I'll try to summarize these as best I can. And there are some, well, I won't summarize. I'm going to read you the whole question because that way you can hear what people are asking. And I'm trying to group a couple of them. So one person asked, if a child scores low in language skills and has low phonological and reading comprehension skills, would this be a diagnosis of dyslexia or just a language deficit? And I think a related one was from a different person that said, I wonder if you could clarify, are you saying that you wouldn't call a student dyslexic if, in addition to reading spelling difficulties, that student also had language comprehension and or production issues? Are those related in your mind as you listen?
Yes, they are. They are, and that doesn't surprise me that people ask that question. I will tell you, because it's kind of interesting how positions have evolved. When I first started getting into the dyslexia world, yeah, I hate to say how many years ago, but at that time, it was very black and white. And when you looked at a diagnosis, you would say, you know, you need to have normal oral language skills and a significant discrepancy between your normal oral and your poor written. Now, when I say written, I mean reading, writing, spelling. I mean any of that piece, okay? And also in the presence of a core phonological deficit. And so it was very, very easy. And so my answer to the first question would be that person, if they scored very poor in oral language as well as phonological, as well as reading, that's an oral language problem. Specific language impairment, not dyslexia. Okay. Now, in the last few years, the position at IDA seems to have swung a little bit. The pendulum's come back a little bit. And so people that will say if a student has trouble with oral language, they might still have dyslexia. See, I'm muddying the water. I hate to even say this to you guys, but I know you're hearing this, so I might as well say it myself. So what you have to look at still is there a discrepancy? Okay. So and there has to be a core phonological deficit. There just has to be. If the phonology is pretty decent or at levels commensurate with everything else, then, you know, it's probably across the board just struggling. But we talked about how you can have trouble with word finding, right? We talked about how you know, any kind of phonological based skill like being able to pronounce complex words, being able to sequence that stuff. Those are language skills. And many times they will show up in some of the language tests that you give that are oral language tests, okay? So sometimes a student could have an oral language disorder and dyslexia if it's a subtle oral language problem, you know, a subtle oral one in the phonology areas we were talking about, versus globally they have trouble with language across the board. And I know that muddies the water because it has gotten a little bit muddy.
Well, that's okay. I think, you know, these are complex topics, and I think people just appreciate your perspective on this. Someone asked, do you have any information about how dyslexia is related to stuttering? I have read time and time again that dyslexia and speech difficulties are so interrelated, but I have never seen any information specifically related to stuttering.
I have never either. I think we could categorically say that stuttering is not related to dyslexia. But what you could say, sometimes when you trip on words, like those complex words like spaghetti and aluminum, and it's that memory of phonological, your phonological memory and sequencing and retrieval. So it might give the impression perhaps of some stuttering if someone's really kind of tripping on a difficult word. But other than that, there really is no research out there to support that
Okay.
stuttering and dyslexia are co-occurring. I mean, they could co-occur, but they're not part of the same constellation.
Okay.
Someone who stutters could have dyslexia, but as a separate.
Okay. So a couple questions about assessments, and I'll read all three of these, and then you can have me repeat them if they're different, because I don't know enough to know, which ones of these might be groupable and which ones aren't. And you might not need to be able to go into all the detail on this, but there was a question: which assessments do you use when you evaluate children with language deficits? Someone asked, what are some assessments that could be used for dyslexia? And a third person asked, other than OWLS, is there another expressive language assessment you recommend to reading specialists?
Okay, so you guys understand that those questions could be a full day workshop. And it really depends on the age of the student. Okay, so I'm going to tackle this in pieces. I'm going to talk first about a language assessment. So if I wanted to know if someone has an oral language, where the oral language skills are, and they were school age, and I wanted to know what their receptive language was like, what their expressive, what was their syntax, their that kind of stuff, I would give a comprehensive test, and I wouldn't even do the OWLS, the OWLS that you mentioned. The OWLS is good for getting you just a basic like vocabulary level, receptive language, but it doesn't get you those other nuances. And as a reading specialist, I would refer for the complex language to the SLP anyway. But good tests, like if you have ever given, I like the Illinois Test of Psycholinguistic Abilities. It's called the ITPA. And the reason I like that is it does have an oral language split and a written language split. So you can see if skills are developing at similar levels or not. The self-tests are wonderful. Those are clinical evaluation of language fundamentals. Again, those are usually in SLP realm, but they're good. And again, if you're looking at an adolescent, then I'd be looking more at maybe the test of adolescent language. There's a new test out called the TILS test of language and test of integrated language and listening skills or something. It's a beast of a test. It tests everything under the sun. And it's supposed to be pretty good. I have it, but I don't like to give it because it takes me forever to score it. And I don't have the time to score like that. So the other question I could say, batteries for dyslexia testing. IDA has a really nice fact sheet about what to look for. And I would refer you guys to that just to make sure that you are sampling phonological awareness. The CTOP is probably the gold standard, comprehensive test of phonological processing. It looks at phonological memory, working memory, phonological awareness. So,
great. Here's a very specific one that you may or may not have an answer on, but someone asked, are the age benchmarks for bilingual children the same as for monolingual children?
Oh boy. Okay, are we saying bilingual as in not English as a second language, but just bilingual?
I happen to know the person who asked this. I think they're talking about someone who's growing up with two languages, like learning two languages at the same time.
Yeah, it kind of depends on the age of the student. So we know that bilingual children, when they're early phases of language development, will have periods where they may not be kind of at similar levels to children who are growing up in a monolingual home. But once you are kind of through that and you're at school age, we don't look at really different benchmarks for development. You would expect the same things at the same ages as you would as a monolingual child, as a general rule.
And this is a very specific question. I think that has to do with English and Japanese, and can a child be dyslexic in one language and not the other? But we can maybe address that off.
Okay, I think you said can someone be dyslexic in one language and not the other?
Right.
The answer would be no. I mean, if your brain is processing we didn't even talk about, brain function and what we know about how the brain functions language for those who are dyslexic and those who are quote unquote normal. But if you have trouble processing phonology, you're gonna do it in any language. You can't be in one and not the other.
Got it. Okay, next question. We still have a few more if you're okay. There's
a few more.
So can SLI be remediated by a tutor, or is it necessary for a student to see an ST?
Yes, it could be remediated by a tutor. I think that the most helpful way, though, would be to at least collaborate with the speech pathologist or speech therapist so that you know really what the deficits are, and they can help give you some guidance as to how to reach those. It kind of just depends what the tutor is tutoring, what your topics are, what your subjects are, and how the specific language impairment would be impacting that. So I think certainly you could collaborate together, but I think collaborate would be the key piece so that you both know what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Oops, I hit the wrong button. Sorry, I was trying to turn my mic back onto my phone off, my thing off. Okay, we have a question here. It said, we would like to know the difference between phonological processing disorder and dyslexia in terms of diagnosis. And the specific question is it that younger children who have yet to have a lot of print exposure get identified with phonological processing disorder, and then later in the evaluation process, that diagnosis will be replaced likely by a dyslexia diagnosis? I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah, that's I don't know who asked that, but way to go. Save the hardest question for the end of the day, at the end of the presentation. What I would say to that is that it's possible. Yeah. I mean, kids who have severe speech sound disorders and have a phonological processing disorder, which again, remember, this is when we're talking about patterns of speech are not being learned correctly. So you might leave off ends of words. You might leave off beginning words. You might make words from the front of the mouth, in the back of the mouth, etc. So those kids, they don't necessarily have dyslexia. I mean, or grow up to have dyslexia. I mean, it isn't like we know if you have A, then you're going to have B. But many of those kids do have and go out to have reading problems. And, are they always identified as dyslexia? I couldn't even tell you I'd have to do some research on that. But there's a correlation, you're right.
Someone asked, they know several students who stumble when they interact speaking and listening with others. I noticed they struggle expressing their thoughts. As you say, they struggle finding words. Mm-hmm. And they're asking for specific strategies that are most effective for helping students address this issue. And I'm not sure if you addressed that or not. I can't always listen 100% to what you're saying. I'm looking at the question. So you may have addressed this, but I want to just ask the question anyway.
So the question is, how do you help students who are having trouble with word finding?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't talk a lot about that. What you might want to do, because I kind of got us out of that video fast because I thought we were running out of time. You might remember that the gal was pointing like this, and then they were going to go give some examples. I would go, whoever asked that question, is go back and watch the full video of that and see if that doesn't give you some good suggestions. There are other resources that you could go to as well, but off the top of my head, I don't have them written down to give you. Sorry.
That's great, not a problem. And so somebody just wrote, thank you for a wonderful opportunity to learn more. The opportunity to hear and ask questions that you don't necessarily have a resource for is greatly appreciated. So of course you get every question that people are thinking about, right?
Yeah.
So if you later think of a resource or I can also send that out as part of the information for the.
Okay. Yeah, I can certainly do that. I can get you some of that and you can send it out. Okay.
Let's see, we don't have I know we're getting late here, but somebody asked, I have a 6th grade student that's struggling with vocabulary and idioms. What do you suggest for vocabulary? don't know if that's something you have any thoughts on. I know there are a lot of vocabulary resources, but
There are many, many. You know what might be good, because I've got several resources that I could list. Maybe I could send to you some of the ideas for vocabulary and, was it word finding? Those are the two? Was this question have a third one there too?
there was word finding. Somebody, I haven't even gotten to this one, but phonological memory or phonological retriever weaknesses. So I guess really anything you talked about that there are weaknesses on, if you have ideas or suggestions, we could just include that in the follow-up email and let people know.
Yeah.
And then I can
Why
attach.
don't I do that? Because there are a few particular, like anything by Louisa Moats is wonderful, and Judith Montgomery has wonderful vocabulary stuff, and there are a couple of really good word finding word retrieval. Oh, idioms, that was the other one she asked, right? Figurative language, yeah. Why don't I just send you a few resources, and then you could.
That sounds good. Here's what I'll do. I'll send you all the questions related to that. You can send me some resources. I will attach them to your PDF so that when someone's watching the video later, they'll actually have those at the time that they watch it, and we'll kind of wrap all that up. So I think with that, Jane, I think we have addressed most of the questions. I may have missed some. I apologize. We had a lot of questions. But also lots and lots of thank yous and thank yous now for sending resources, and so I'll compile those questions and we can get those put together.
Okay,
so,
very good.
Good. Well, with this, I think we will wrap up for tonight. And Jane, obviously, we had a lot of interest in this. We're so grateful that you were willing to be here and talk with us about this. I am going to just remind the attendees that you can go to our website at UMW for Upper Midwest.dyslexiaida.org, and you'll find all of our recorded webinars, registration information for upcoming webinars, information about dyslexia, some of the fact sheets that Jane, you mentioned, we have linked at that website. And so that can be a good resource for people going forward. So I want to again thank everyone for being here tonight. Thank you, Jane, for being here, and good night to everyone.
All right, good night.